It is indeed a great honor to be here, to be part of this conference. When we really gaze into the future of food and food systems and look at what resilience means, it is not only the capacity of food systems to provide nutrition security to all, but also to withstand the varied challenges that changing times will throw at the food systems and agriculture. So I'll try and deal with some of those aspects. Certainly from point of view of vulnerability of agriculture and food systems, we are looking at climate change as one of the elements that is going to be posing a major challenge. We recognize that even as we try and look for stability in food systems, we are not going to be living in times that are going to be absolutely a continuation of the present. We are going to see several changes and challenges where the agriculture and food systems will become increasingly vulnerable. Secondly, we will also see how commerce, which is already shaping agriculture and food systems in terms of nutrition security and the quality of food that is available to people, is also going to be an important element we'll have to contend with as we try and look for resilient food systems. And conflict, which unfortunately has become a more recurrent feature in this century, also can be posing a challenge to food systems and nutrition security. And these sometimes act in tandem. When we look at climate change, for example, we see, of course, reference to heat effects, which can be both physical and mental, waterborne and vector-borne diseases, extreme weather events, exacerbated air pollution, climate refugees, increased risk of chronic diseases. But the discussion of the impact on agriculture and nutrition security somehow often slips into the background. And indeed, even the other elements that we have talked about, whether it is heat effects, or even extreme weather events, or even waterborne diseases for that matter, upset the stability of the human ecosystem and will also have an impact upon agriculture and nutrition security. And when we talk in terms of equity, the poor will invariably be the worst victims. So we are currently facing a challenge that affects how we approach agriculture, food systems, and nutrition. We recognize that there is an increasing demand for food, but at the same time, there are several challenges to the availability and affordability of food. And some of these challenges will be those which increase the demand for food, like increasing global population and urbanization, and even diminishing poverty levels, which will actually increase the aspirational levels of people. But at the same time, the availability of food becomes less as we are challenged by the increasing size of the global population, with an aging population demanding more in larger numbers, and we'll also have diminished arable land and also a challenge of the water usage and water security. And we have already heard a reference to the impact of changing food prices. The world will need to produce about 60% more food to feed a population of about 9 billion in 2050. And as food systems evolve to address the challenges of population growth, environmental change, and economic instability, we should ensure that they also improve nutrition. Because nutrition security means that everybody gets not only available and affordable diets, but they're adequate in terms of their nutrition content. And the biggest challenge is going to come to us from global warming. We are going to be seeing that if it is business as usual, we'll see by the end of the century a 4.2 degree centigrade rise in temperature. And if we take the Paris pledges into account, we will see 3.3 degrees rise in temperature, whereas we are targeting 1.5 degree centigrade as the possible upper limit that we can tolerate. And if the US withdraws from the Paris pledges, as the move has been initiated, we'll see a 3.6 degrees rise in temperature. And this is going to have an impact upon nutrition. By 2100, 40% of the world's land surface will likely experience altered climates. And up to 2050, agricultural output is projected to fall by 2% per decade due to the impact of climate change on crop and livestock production, whereas food demand is projected to rise by 14% per decade due to population growth, urbanization, and poverty reduction, making more aspirational lifestyles the norm as people graduate to a higher income level. When we look at climate change through the nutrition lens, we recognize that higher production of staple crops will not be enough to make agriculture more resilient to climate change or better able to address the world's need for improved diets. We already have seen that the staples are not the sole answer to nutritional adequacy or security. Nutrient-rich crops, which often include non-staples and fruits and vegetables, will be more susceptible to droughts, pests, disease, and temperature fluctuations. And higher carbon dioxide in atmosphere is likely to reduce nutrient content of even staple crops. And soil degradation, which also accompanies climate change, will also reduce nutrient quality. If you look at the responses to heat stress, we see that these are non-linear responses, whether it's corn, soybean, or even a non-nutrient crop like cotton. All of these are highly susceptible to diminished yields at higher temperatures. But some parts of the world will be even more vulnerable than other parts of the world. Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia are particularly prone to productivity losses from climate change because even as of now, major staples in these regions are often grown above their optimum temperature, and with even a 1 degree rise in temperature further, there can be as much as a 10% yield loss in some of the locations. If you look at what has been predicted as the potential impact of rising temperatures, the reduction in rice yield is predicted to be about 6.6%. Reduction in wheat yield is predicted to be about 9.1%. But this will not be all. It will not be just the impact of heat directly on the staples. As humans, in the rising temperatures, wilt and lie listless, the pests will become more active and grow. So the effect of pest-induced loss will be much more. And we'll find that there will be an additional loss in rice of 2% and in wheat of an additional 1.6%. So really, we are looking at about 10% loss in yields overall because of the combined effect of heat and pest-induced loss. When we look at nutrient loss due to heat, again, many nutrient crops would have 3 to 17% lower concentration of protein, iron, and zinc. Again, we have referred to the importance of these micronutrients. So when these crops grow under elevated carbon dioxide levels of more than 550 parts per million, you're likely to see some of these important nutrients depleted from the crops. And we'll also find that by 2050, India would experience about 2.9% increase in zinc-deficient population, and resulting in about 49.6 million new zinc-deficient persons. And there would be a 2.2% increase in protein-deficient population with about 38.2 million new protein-deficient persons. And about 106 million children and 396 million women would become iron deficient. So we're going to see a huge impact of heat as India experiences climate change. And when we talk about the changes in staples and some of the non-staples, we must recognize that even fruit, which is considered to be very important from the point of view of nutrition, will ripen early and rot early. So we are going to see many of the important elements which contribute to healthy nutrition also suffering because of climate change, both staples as well as non-staples. But there is hope. It's not all doom and gloom. India, according to a recent study from the Data Science Institute, the Columbia University, says can sustainably enhance its food supply if its farmers plant less rice and more nutritious and environmental friendly crops, according to a new study. So while certainly the green revolution which pushed rice was very much needed in the 60s and 70s, we now need to have a fresh look as to what we can do in terms of alternate crops. This study by the Data Science Institute at the Columbia University finds that diversifying crop production in India, replacing some of the rice, which is India's main crop, with millets and sorghum, would make the nation's food supply more nutritious while reducing irrigation demand, energy use, and greenhouse gas emissions. Such diversification of crops would also enhance India's climate resilience without reducing calorie production or requiring more land. Now, this also brings into account what agriculture and food systems do to the environment, not merely what environment does to the agriculture and food systems. We recognize that there is a mutually detrimental relationship if agriculture and food systems also start undermining the environment through greenhouse gas production, through excessive deforestation, as well as excessive water usage. And given that equation, and that's quite considerable. Actually, agriculture and food systems are responsible for 29% of greenhouse gas emissions. They are responsible for about 70% of water usage and about 80% of deforestation across the world, some of which is necessary for agriculture, but all of it at that extravagant level is certainly avoidable because it damages the climate. And we are seeing already some shifts happening in India. For example, in the very drought-prone region of Marathwada, which actually keeps reporting farmer suicides. Now, smallholder women farmers in climate-threatened Marathwada region are ensuring nutrition security and additional income from their families through diversified organic agriculture. And this has been reported to be an important element in actually ensuring that families are being lifted out of poverty even while providing more ecologically and economically sustainable crop diversification. Similarly, again, we are finding in Maharashtra, switching from traditional crops, farmers in rain shadow areas of Maharashtra have found that growing custard apple is suited for varied soil and climatic conditions and is highly remunerative while being very water efficient. And that brings us to the question of what, apart from heat stress, water stress does to agriculture and food systems. We recognize that much of the world is already facing a challenge in terms of water availability, either being water stressed or being water scarce. Now, we find that India in particular is currently water stressed, but it can move substantially to a water crisis, because 54% of India faces extremely high water stress. At the same time, we recognize that warming is increasing the level of the seawater, and this has markedly increased in recent years, with a rate of change being about 3.4 millimeters per year. And this is beginning to flood the coastal areas, including where crops are being cultivated and which are dependent upon fresh water for their cultivation, apart from upsetting the ocean marine life and the ocean ecology. When we come to fish, again, fish has been referred to in the previous talk as an important contributor to nutrition. India has about over 7,000 kilometers of coastline, and fish does constitute an integral part of diet for many communities, particularly those living along the coastline. And fisheries are also a source of livelihood for millions of people. But we now recognize that marine fish catch has fallen since 1996 at an annual rate of about 1.2 2 metric tons per year. Now, this can leave the population highly vulnerable to both nutritional deficiencies as well as economic deprivation because of loss of livelihood. Ocean warming is predicted to impact fish diversity, distribution, abundance, and phenology. We are also seeing how rising seawater levels are now inundating the freshwater rivers that drain into it and are compromising agriculture in those areas. In the Sundarbans, both in India as well as in Bangladesh, we are seeing displacement and migration of farmers because rice cultivation is no longer possible in the salt-drenched freshwaters. And that again is creating a huge crisis of climate refugees. So what we need is climate-smart agriculture, which can withstand heat stress, which can withstand water stress, and can promise us high yields per unit of land, water, and energy. And these have to be of high nutrient value, they have to be pest resistant, and not easily perishable. So this is the kind of agriculture that we need to really look into for the future in an era of climate change, which we can partially control but cannot completely eliminate. So the global panel in this context recommends that we should include diet quality goals within adaptation targets proposed for climate action, because this is not really featured as much in the climate discussion. Diversify agricultural investments, factoring in the local realities of ecological suitability and comparative advantage. Support greater food system efficiency so that output per unit of water, energy, land, and other inputs are optimized, and the footprint of agriculture and non-farm activities are better managed to meet both food demand and higher quality diets. We must integrate measures to improve climate change resilience and nutritional value of crop and livestock products along the value chain from production to marketing. And protect the diet quality of the poor, in particular, in the face of supply shocks and growing food demand. And finally, to promote the generation and use of rigorous evidence on appropriate investments along the food value chains, which are resilient to climate change and also deliver positive dietary outcomes and support improved nutrition. What is not added in these recommendations is that we must also ensure that we develop innovations in agriculture and food systems. They also are ecologically sound and spare the climate from further degradation. Now coming to commerce, which is the other destabilizing element in terms of resilience, the Harvard Healthy Eating Plate model shows what a good diet should consist of in terms of dietary diversity on a plate. And we recognize, of course, that fruits and vegetables should constitute a substantial amount, and the remaining ones are shown in other fractions. On the other hand, contrast it with the other plate, which is what we are actually producing according to the Food and Agriculture Organization. And you can see the marked contrast between where the production systems are actually pushing us towards and which are quite deviant from what is nutritionally appropriate and recommended. And we also recognize that the demand for food and the food preferences are also being shaped substantially by commercial considerations, where there is a mismatch between science and commerce. Whether you want a plate or a pyramid, you know that what the proportion should be, what should be eaten in plenty, what should be eaten in moderation, and what should be eaten occasionally. On the other hand, what is marketed most aggressively is a completely reverse pyramid, where those which are not really desirable and should, if at all, be consumed very occasionally are the ones that are most advertised, most promoted, and which are seen as most desirable in the people who are subjected to that barrage of advertising. So we do need policy interventions on diet. We recognize that even as chronic diseases are rising, there are countries which have demonstrated through policy instruments that we can actually change the scenario. For example, in Mauritius, by switching the price of edible oils, the ration oil, from palm oil to soybean oil, they brought down the mean plasma cholesterol levels in the population. In Poland, after the fall of the Soviet Union, greater import of fruit and vegetables and healthier edible oils brought about a change, again, in steep decline in cardiovascular mortality rates. Finland, which had the highest cardiovascular mortality rates in the 1960s and 70s, then became, after 25 years, the poster child for preventive cardiology by bringing about changes in farming, marketing, and community education, and bringing down plasma cholesterol levels within 20 years from 272 milligrams per cent to 220 milligrams per cent in the average level. And we are seeing new initiatives like taxes on sugar-sweetened beverages, food labeling, reduced salt in processed foods, ban on trans fats, and advertising restrictions. Several of these will have to be adopted if we have to really make sure that pure commercial considerations are not going to lead nutrition astray through altered food and food systems. And therefore, the global panel does recommend that we do take a broad view of the food environment. And we not only look at food supply from the point of view of agricultural production, but also look at it from the point of view of food transformation and retail, of factors shaping food marketing and the food demand, and all of these ultimately will impact upon food choices. Coming to finally, we recognize that we are not necessarily living in a very stable society. And here conflict can again either cause or aggravate food insecurity, both through disrupted agriculture as well as through migration, forced migration. And if you add sanctions to that on top of it, it can certainly result in a very harmful mix of food insecurity. Just to give you a case study, Iran, for example, is one of the countries which is experiencing severe water crisis. In fact, it is one of the countries which is listed in the top 10, almost at number 4, of countries which has a severe water deficiency. And therefore, agricultural production is affected. Now you have sanctions imposed and imports are obstructed. Now we recognize that water is a major issue there. Like, for example, low precipitation levels due to climate change have aggravated Iran's water scarcity in recent years, and this is climate change. In March 2017 to March 2018, in that particular year, which is based upon the Iranian calendar, precipitation levels fell by 25%. So, without going into the politics of it, we recognize that world over, we are seeing the combined impact of climate change and conflict, and sometimes commerce does not necessarily respond in the most beneficial manner. And it is this toxic mix of several factors which actually will challenge the resilience of our food systems and agriculture in the future and threaten nutrition security for the present and the future generations. So we must use the Sustainable Development Goals agenda because there are clear-cut goals of freedom from hunger, of freedom from disease, and we must steer governments, private sector, agriculture, which is agriculture, industry, and trade, constituting the private sector, consumers, whether it's organizations or individuals, civil society, and international organizations, to promote and protect sustainable and resilient agriculture and food systems, which should be shielded from the impact of climate change, harmful commercial drivers, and conflict-induced damage and deprivation. So what we need to do is, as Toni Morrison tells us, is to shape the future. Toni Morrison, the Nobel laureate who wrote the Song of Solomon, wrote, "If we do not create the future, we extend the present. But it's going to be even more dangerous. The present will not be static. It can grow worse because of climate change, commercial considerations, as well as conflict. So we need to proactively ensure that we can take actions that can influence all of these determinants. How we can provide nutrition security and ecological sustainability for the present and future generations is going to be the hallmark of our civilization and the standard of success for our science. And therefore, we need to act proactively, not through a passive response, but through an active collective response. Thank you for your attention.